He is one of the most famous figures in all of human history. A king of legendary wisdom, whose very name has become a synonym for genius. A ruler of unimaginable wealth, who supposedly received hundreds of tons of gold in tribute every year. A builder who raised the most sacred temple the world has ever known. 3,000 years after he lived, King Solomon is still celebrated in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike. His story has shaped the faith of billions. And yet, if you went looking for the physical proof that he ever existed, for his tomb, for his palace, for a single inscription bearing his name, you would search the entire Holy Land from end to end and find something that, to many people, is genuinely shocking. Nothing. Not a trace. Let me show you what archaeologists really believe about King Solomon, his tomb, and the mystery at the heart of one of history's greatest legends. First, the legend. According to the Hebrew Bible, Solomon was the son of the great King David, and he ruled the United Kingdom of Israel around 970 to 931 before the Common Era. He was, the texts say, the wisest man who ever lived. Kings and queens traveled from across the known world to hear him speak, including the legendary Queen of Sheba. He composed thousands of proverbs and songs. He accumulated wealth beyond reckoning, 666 talents of gold in a single year, by one account. He maintained a household of 700 wives and 300 concubines, political alliances sealed with marriage. And his greatest achievement was the building of the first temple in Jerusalem, a magnificent house for God, constructed with cedar from Lebanon, gold overlay throughout, and bronze pillars so massive they were given names. By any measure, Solomon was, in the biblical telling, one of the most powerful and opulent monarchs the ancient world had ever seen. So where is his tomb? It is a question that has driven explorers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters for centuries. The Bible says Solomon was buried in the city of David, in Jerusalem, alongside his fathers. And for over 100 years, archaeologists have been digging in and around that ancient city, turning over every stone, hoping to find the resting place of the great king. They have not found it. No tomb of Solomon has ever been discovered. No chamber, no sarcophagus, no royal inscription marking his grave. Nothing. And the absence goes further than just the tomb. In all the decades of excavation across Israel, in all the thousands of sites dug, surveyed, and sifted, archaeologists have never found a single inscription bearing the name Solomon. Not one. No clay tablet, no stone monument, no seal, no coin, no contemporary document of any kind from any kingdom that so much as mentions him by name. And it is not just inscriptions that are missing. No confirmed palace has been found. No royal archive. No grand gateway inscribed with his achievements, of the kind that kings across the ancient Near East routinely erected. For a ruler supposedly surrounded by unparalleled splendor, the silence in the dirt is deafening. For many people, this is genuinely shocking. How can one of the most famous, most powerful, most wealthy kings in the ancient world have left absolutely no physical trace? How can a man who supposedly ruled an empire stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt, who received queens and ambassadors, who built temples and palaces and fortified cities, have vanished so completely from the archaeological record? The answer, archaeologists will tell you, is complicated. And it begins with the most important fact about the search for Solomon. The single most likely place to find evidence of him, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site where Solomon supposedly built his great temple, is also the most impossible place on earth to dig. The Temple Mount is one of the most sacred and most contested pieces of ground on the planet. For Jews, it is the holiest site in Judaism, the place where the first and second temples stood. For Muslims, it is the third holiest site in Islam, home to the magnificent Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. For political and religious reasons, no archaeological excavation has ever been permitted there. The ground where Solomon's temple and palace most likely stood, the ground that could hold the answers to the entire mystery, is effectively off-limits to science. We cannot look, and that single fact haunts every attempt to understand Solomon. We may be standing right on top of his tomb, right on top of his palace, and never know it. But even away from the Temple Mount, the evidence is remarkably thin. There have been tantalizing hints. The late archaeologist Eilat Mazar, working in the city of David in the Offal area just south of the Temple Mount, claimed to have uncovered remnants of monumental structures dating to the 10th century, which she identified as parts of King David's palace and Solomon's royal construction. Her finds generated enormous excitement and fierce debate. Some scholars embraced her conclusions. Others argued the dating was uncertain, and that the structures could belong to a later period. The debate, like so much in biblical archaeology, remains unresolved. What everyone agrees on is this: something significant was being built in Jerusalem during the 10th century. But connecting those stones to the specific figures of David and Solomon, with the grandeur described in the Bible, remains a leap that many scholars are unwilling to make without more evidence. The closest thing archaeologists have found to independent confirmation of Solomon's dynasty is not evidence of Solomon himself, but of his father, David. In 1993, at a site called Tel Dan in northern Israel, archaeologists discovered a stone inscription dating to the 9th century before the Common Era that mentions the House of David. It was the first and still the only time the name of David has been found in an inscription outside the Bible. It proved, to most scholars, that David was a real historical figure, or at least that a dynasty associated with him existed. But Solomon? For Solomon, there is nothing comparable. No Tel Dan Stele. No external attestation of any kind. He remains, archaeologically, a ghost. Then there are the so-called King Solomon's mines. In the Timna Valley, deep in the desert of southern Israel, archaeologists have uncovered an extensive copper mining and smelting operation dating to the 10th century before the Common Era, exactly the period when Solomon supposedly reigned. The site is extraordinary, revealing a sophisticated, organized industry with fortifications, gatehouses, and donkey stables. For decades, people called them King Solomon's mines. But even the archaeologists who excavate the site are careful. The mines, they say, were most likely operated not by Israelites, but by the Edomites, a desert people who lived in the region. The dates match Solomon's era. The scale suggests a complex society. But a direct link to Solomon himself, or to Jerusalem, remains unproven. The mines tell us that powerful, organized societies existed in the region during Solomon's time. They do not prove that Solomon was one of them. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. In the world of biblical archaeology, there is a deep and often bitter divide between two camps. On one side are the Maximalists, scholars who believe the biblical account is broadly reliable, that David and Solomon ruled a real, powerful united monarchy, and that the grandeur described in the texts reflects historical reality. On the other side are the Minimalists, scholars who argue that the biblical accounts were written centuries later as political propaganda, and that David and Solomon, if they existed at all, were minor chieftains of a small highland village, not the rulers of a vast empire. The debate between them has been fierce, personal, and unresolved for decades. So what do archaeologists actually believe? The current consensus, as reflected in scholarly literature, is a careful middle ground. Scholars on both sides of the debate generally agree that Solomon probably existed, that there was likely a historical figure who ruled from Jerusalem in the 10th century before the Common Era. But the biblical description of his empire's lavishness, its vast territory, its enormous wealth, is almost surely, in the words of scholars, an anachronistic exaggeration. Solomon was likely a real king. He may well have been a significant one. But he was probably not the fabulously wealthy, globe-spanning monarch the Bible describes. That picture was likely embellished and written down centuries after his death by people with their own political and religious purposes. The biblical texts that describe Solomon, the books of Kings and Chronicles, were not composed during his lifetime. Most scholars believe they were compiled and edited centuries later, during the period of the Babylonian exile and the return to Jerusalem, perhaps around the 7th or 6th century before the Common Era. By that time, Solomon's putative reign lay 300 to 400 years in the past, and the writers had every reason to look back on that era as a golden age, a time of unity, power, and divine favor, especially when their own present was one of conquest, exile, and ruin. It is a pattern seen in cultures across the ancient world. The past is remembered not as it was, but as the present needs it to be. Solomon, in the telling, may have grown larger with each retelling, his modest kingdom expanding into an empire, his local influence magnifying into global renown, until the man and the myth became inseparable. And this is the shock. Not that Solomon never existed, but that the gap between the legend and the evidence is so enormous. We have a king described in almost godlike terms, ruling an empire of staggering wealth, and we cannot point to a single stone, a single inscription, a single tomb that we can say, with certainty, was his. The absence is so complete and so startling that it forces a profound question. How much of what we think we know about the ancient world comes from the stones in the ground, and how much comes from the stories we have chosen to tell? And yet, the honest archaeologist will always add one more thing. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The ancient Near East was a world of mud brick and wood, of materials that rot and crumble. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt dozens of times. The one place most likely to hold the answers cannot be excavated. It is entirely possible that Solomon's tomb, his palace, his records, all lie buried beneath the Temple Mount, waiting, unreachable, for a peace that may never come. We simply do not know. And that, perhaps, is the most shocking thing of all. That the tomb of one of history's greatest kings may be resting 30 feet beneath our feet in the most contested square mile on Earth, and we may never, ever be allowed to look. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the tomb of King Solomon is real, and it lies beneath the most sacred and contested place on Earth, should we ever try to find it, even if finding it could change the world? I want to hear your answer. Drop it in the comments below. If this journey into the mystery of Solomon moved you, share it with someone who loves history and faith. And subscribe, because the next secret we uncover from the past might be the one that changes everything. Until next time, question the legends, honor the search, and never assume that the famous story is the full story. I am Arif Hassan, and this is AH History.